Folks, today we're going to be discussing Chapter 35, Respiration. The process of respiration is to supply body cells with oxygen from the environment and to deliver waste carbon dioxide back to the environment. So just think about it. Right now, you're breathing. You're inhaling oxygen from the environment. And then as you exhale, you're delivering waste and carbon dioxide back out to the environment. The equation for respiration is glucose plus oxygen equals carbon dioxide and water. And I expect you guys to know that equation. You don't have to worry about the chemical reaction. Just know glucose plus oxygen equals carbon dioxide and water for your exam. And you get glucose from your diet. So think glucose is a sugar, and so we extract that from our diet, plus the oxygen we breathe in is going to lead to carbon dioxide being breathed out and water. So respiration is a physiological process by which an animal's body supplies cells with oxygen and disposes of waste and carbon dioxide. Gases enter and leave the animal body by diffusing across a thin, moist respiratory surface. Where is your respiratory surface? Your respiratory surface is in your lungs. A second exchange of gases occurs internally at the plasma membrane of the body cells. In humans, it's going to be your red blood cells, in which oxygen is going to diffuse into the red blood cells and CO2 would diffuse out when at the lungs. And then those red blood cells will then deliver that oxygen to other parts of your body and pick up the carbon dioxide to bring it back to the lungs. So what is a respiratory surface? It's a moist surface across which gases are exchanged between the animal cells and the external environment. It's extremely thin, only 1 to 2 cells thick. So think your lung tissue is extremely thin and moist, and it allows gases to travel quickly into the body. That's why the tissue is so thin. And it's moist because gases can diffuse only across a moist surface, not a dry surface. So that's why your lungs are always moist and very thin, because that is your respiratory surface. There are various types of gas exchange surfaces. Some organisms have external gills, like we see here on this lizard. Others have internal gills, like on lobsters and fish. We have lungs, similar to this rabbit, and then some organisms, such as this praying mantis, have something called a trachea. The larger the area of the respiratory surface, the more molecules can cross it in any given time. So in your lungs, and this is a really cool picture, this is what they did was they literally pumped lungs with a plastic and then they dissolved the tissues around it. And what you can see is all the branches and foldings of the various parts of the lungs. And this is very important because this is going to increase the surface area of your respiratory tissue or your lungs. And so this branching and folding is going to increase the surface area for oxygen to cross into your bloodstream and for CO2 to leave your bloodstream. Just think about how big your lungs are compared to the rest of your body. They take up a huge part of your body because your body needs that much oxygen and also needs to release all the CO2 and waste out of the blood. Other factors that affect gas exchange include respiratory proteins, proteins that contain one or more metal ions that reversibly bind oxygen and oxygen concentration is high and release it when oxygen concentration is low. In humans, our red blood cells contain the respiratory hemoglobin. Please know that for your exam. Humans have hemoglobin in their blood. When hemoglobin binds to oxygen, it is taking that oxygen away from the lungs and encourages more oxygen to enter the lungs. Please know your blood is not blue. I repeat, your blood is not blue. No matter what anyone told you in high school or middle school, we do not have any blue blood in our bodies. What you see in the pictures, which you may have seen in previous slides, and you'll see this in this presentation, is that low oxygen blood looks blue in the pictures, but in real life, low oxygen blood is actually like a dark purple color. And when your red blood cells pick up oxygen and your hemoglobin binds to oxygen in those red blood cells, then it becomes bright red. So hemoglobin is the respiratory protein in vertebrates, including us. There are other, and it looks like this, there are other types of respiratory proteins, including hemocyanin. This respiratory protein is found in invertebrates, including octopus and horseshoe crabs, and it actually turns blue when it carries oxygen. And there's something called hemothyrin, and this is a respiratory protein of aquatic worms. Note, in humans, we have hemoglobin, and it is not blue, it is red. Most invertebrates, those are organisms without a backbone, are aquatic and exchange gases with their water surroundings. They don't have a circulatory system or lungs like we do, and they're usually small and flat to allow for gas exchange to occur over their bodies. Some have adapted to life on land and exchange gases with the air. This is an example of organisms that do not have a respiratory system. This is a cnidarian, and this is a flatworm, and both these organisms exchange gases with the environment across the body wall and lining of the gastrovascular cavity that also functions in digestion. So what does that mean? That means that literally oxygen is going to diffuse into the bodies of these organisms across their skin or the cells, their outermost cells, and CO2 is going to diffuse across the bodies back out into the water. There's no gills, there's no lungs. What happened was these organisms would start to evolve and a circulatory system would evolve. So the evolution of the circulatory system and blood with respiratory pigments like hemoglobin increased the efficiency of oxygen distribution through the body. In earthworms, they have a closed circulatory system that carries hemoglobin-containing blood to and from the damp body wall that serves as a respiratory surface. So they exchange oxygen across their skin as well, but they have a closed circulatory system, which means that they have blood vessels, and they have vessels that carry oxygenated and deoxygenated blood. Hemoglobin also transports oxygen in the blood of mollusks, like clams and oysters, and some arthropods. Then gills evolved, and gills evolved in invertebrates with a circulatory system. As blood moves through gills, it picks up oxygen from the water and it gives up carbon dioxide. So gills, which we're all pretty familiar with from going fishing or looking in the fish tanks in Go Hall, are folds over body extensions well supplied with blood vessels that increase the surface area for respiration. So if you've ever looked at a fish's gills or even an oyster's gills, you will see lots and lots of tiny blood vessels in there. In land invertebrates, like this grasshopper, so remember insects don't have a backbone, they have that hard exoskeleton, which we learned about in the last lecture, and that exoskeleton blocks gas exchange across the body's surface. So compared to an earthworm, which has a hydrostatic skeleton, remember that word, this guy has such a hard exoskeleton that it can't actually exchange air across its body. So instead, it uses something called a tracheal system. And a tracheal system basically is a bunch of tubes that deliver air from the body surface to the tissues of insects and some other land-dwelling arthropods. So literally, this insect has holes along its body that will take up oxygen and release CO2. And those holes are called spiracles. Depending on the species, vertebrates exchange gases across gills, skin, or the surface of paired internal lungs. And we are most familiar with having paired internal lungs. Fishes have gill slits that open across the pharynx, and most tetrapods have paired lungs. And tetrapods would mean you have two arms and two legs. So let's talk about respiration in fish, or breathing in fish. In fish, what happens is water flows into the mouth, enters the pharynx, and then moves out of the body through the gill slits. So if you've ever seen a fish moving its mouth open and close, it's literally bringing water in to pass over the gills. Each gill has a bony gill arch with thin gill filaments, and inside each filament are many capillary beds where gases and water are exchanged with gases and blood. If you remember, capillaries are the smallest blood vessels that we have. And the reason why we have those is to slow the flow of blood so that each red blood cell can exchange oxygen and CO2. Please watch this video. It's an awesome video that animates exactly how gills work. So fish use something called countercurrent exchange, and I will absolutely ask you a question on your exam about countercurrent exchange. This is when water flowing over gills in one direction and blood is flowing through gill capillaries in the opposite direction. So you've got water moving in one direction and you have the blood moving in the opposite direction. And the reason for this is that the exchange of substances between the fluids moving in opposite directions. So your water, which contains a ton of oxygen, will start to diffuse into the blood, and as it's losing that oxygen, the CO2 from the blood will then get exchanged into the water. Lungs evolved from outpouchings of the gut wall in some bony fish and became increasingly important as aquatic tetrapods began moving onto land. These are fish that actually have gills and lungs, and what happens is they can pop from one pond to the other. So if a pond's drying up or it's not conducive for living in anymore, then what these fish do is literally they'll jump out of the pond and try to land into another pond or body of water. So a lung is a sac-like respiratory organ that lies inside a body cavity. Like us or birds, reptiles, and mammals, you have waterproof skin. And so if you have waterproof skin, you have to have lungs because you can't exchange gases across your skin. Remember, gas exchange can only occur along a respiratory surface, which needs to be thin and moist. So only respiratory surface is the moist lining of our lungs, and lungs inflate when muscles increase the size of the thoracic cavity. In mammals, as well as amphibians and most reptiles, the expansion of the chest cavity draws air into increasingly smaller branches or tubes at the end at alveoli. So you have these branches and tubes within your lungs, which we're going to talk about which they're all called. But at the very end are these little berry-like things, and they're called alveoli in plural, or an alveolus, which is just one of these. And what they are they're tiny air sacs in the mammalian lungs, and they are the site of gas exchange. So this is the site where red blood cells will pick up oxygen and release CO2 in the lungs. So please know that alveoli, or alveolus, are the tiny air sacs in your lungs where gas exchange actually occurs. So what should you know so far? Respiration is a physiological process that moves oxygen from the outside environment to all metabolically active tissues and moves carbon dioxide from those tissues to the environment. Respiratory organs such as gills, tracheal tubes, and lungs enhance the rate of gas exchange. So let's talk about our respiratory system now. And I'm going to tell you right now that I'm going to expect you all to know the different parts of your respiratory system, as well as know how oxygen gets breathed in and where it goes through the body. So the respiratory system functions in gas exchange, or literally the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide, but it has many additional functions as well. Airways, lungs, and some skeletal muscles of the chest play a huge role in human respiration. So some of the other functions of your respiratory system besides gas exchange are your voice. If you didn't know this, your voice is air that moves past your vocal cords. Your smell, so remember your olfactory receptors in the nose, you have to breathe in to smell something. Your immune system utilizes your respiratory system. Cells lining the airways help defend the body and intercept and or neutralize airborne pathogens. So whenever you breathe in a bad guy, a germ or a virus, you have immune cells in your respiratory system that protect you. It can also help control acid-base balance by exhaling waste carbon dioxide that makes the blood acidic. So when you have too much CO2 in your body, your blood will actually become acidic, and it also helps maintain your body's temperature. So let's start from the top. Air is taken in through the nose and enters the nostrils. Duh, Dr. Hollander, we already knew that. You have nostril hairs that filter out any large particles, and you have mucus that will capture any fine particles like dust, dander, or pollen. Now you're probably wondering, that's nice, but if you've ever been to like a campfire or you've been barbecuing or grilling out, you might notice that like your boogies in your nose turn black, and that's because your nostril hairs have filtered out any large particles of smoke, and then the mucus, or what ends up becoming your boogers, will capture any fine particles or dust. From the nostrils, the air will enter the nasal cavity where it'll get warmed, and the next stop is the pharynx, or also known as the throat. So you're going to breathe in air through your nostrils, and then it'll get filtered and warmed, and then it'll reach your pharynx, or also known as your throat. So Here we go. You enter into the nasal cavity or the mouth. It's going to enter the pharynx. It's going to continue to the larynx, a short airway commonly known as the voice box. This is where your vocal cords are. And each vocal cord is a skeletal muscle that's covered in mucus-secreting epithelium. Contraction of your vocal cord is going to change the size of the glottis, or literally the gap between them. And then you also have something called an epiglottis. And this is a flap of tissue that will fold over the larynx to basically help prevent getting food in your lungs when eating. So if you've ever noticed you can't breathe and eat at the same time, and that's because your epiglottis is going to protect your lungs from getting food in them. Now, does that always work? No. I think we've all choked on food or water, especially like when you're laughing at your buddy at the lunch table and you accidentally get some water down the wrong tube. So let's talk about these vocal cords. And this is a really cool but kind of gross video that actually shows an opera singer's glottis. So contraction of the vocal cords, which is what you see here. They're kind of like the muscle-y looking things. What they do is they change the size of the glottis, and the glottis is the hole that you see here. So the glottis is actually not an organ. It's the space between the vocal cords. So when the glottis is wide open, air flows through it silently. So here we have the glottis that's wide open. This would be when you're sitting there quietly, not saying a word. When vocal cord muscles contract, what happens is it's going to close the glottis up, forcing air to vibrate those vocal cords, and changes in position of the larynx and tension on the cords gives various pitches of your voice. So definitely watch this video. It's pretty cool to see this woman singing different pitches and seeing how her vocal cords contract, and you see the opening and closing of the glottis, or the space between the vocal cords. So key terms and parts of your respiratory system. You have your pharynx. It's literally your throat. It opens to airways and digestive tract. Then you have your larynx. This is a short airway containing your vocal cords or voice box. And then you have your glottis, which is the opening formed when the vocal cords are nice and relaxed. Then you have your epiglottis. This is the tissue flap that folds down to prevent food from entering the airways when you swallow. So your epiglottis will be just chilling up when you're not eating and you're just talking, and then it'll fold down whenever you take a sip of water or swallow your food. When you're breathing, the epiglottis points up and air moves into the cartilage-reinforced trachea, directing air towards the lungs. So if you've ever heard of someone getting a trach or a tube in their throat, like if you watch those ER shows or Chicago hospital shows, what that is that's going to be a cartilage and reinforced tube that leads to your lungs. So if someone has a blocked airway, they may bypass that by putting a trach in or a tube into the trachea. The trachea then branches into two bronchi. Don't worry, I have a picture coming to show you all this, which delivers air to the lungs. And then mucus secreted by epithelial lining the bronchi will trap any airborne bacteria and particles, which are swept by cilia toward the throat for expulsion. So if you ever had like hot loogie or you get some mucus that you need to cough up, that's the mucus secreted by epithelial lining to trap any bad guys that you breathe in. So here we go. Here's your larynx. And then you have your trachea, which is also called your windpipe. And this is the cartilage reinforced tube that leads into your lungs. Within your lungs, you have two bronchi, or here they call it a bronchus. And this basically is the airway connecting to the trachea to the lung. In the thoracic cavity, you have two cone-shaped lungs, each covered by a double membrane. Inside each lung, air flows through finer and finer branches of bronchiola. So you have your trachea, you have your bronchus or bronchi, because there's two of them. And then from the bronchi, you see these teeny tiny little attachments. These are bronchioles. So you go from trachea to bronchi to bronchioles. At the tips of the finest bronchioles are the respiratory alveoli, which were those berry-shaped things I showed you earlier, and that's where gases are exchanged. So bronchioli are small airways that lead from the bronchus to the alveoli. So they're literally the middlemen between the bronchus and the alveoli. A broad sheet of smooth muscle beneath the lungs, called your diaphragm, is what separates your thoracic cavity and your abdominal cavity. If you're a singer or a musician, you hear a lot about your diaphragm because it can help you control your breathing. It is the only smooth muscle that can be controlled voluntarily in the entire body. So, your diaphragm is the muscle between the thoracic and abdominal cavities. What happens is it's going to contract during inhalation and relax during exhalation. So, there are two sets of skeletal muscles between the ribs called the intercostal muscles, and one set is external to the rib cage and functions in inhalation, and the other set is inside the rib cage and acts during the force of exhalation. So if you breathe in, and let's all breathe in together, we'll take one big soothing breath. You will see your chest rise, and that means that you literally are having your diaphragm push up to allow for your lungs to expand, and you have a set of muscles that are going to help expand your rib cage and your lungs to fill in with air. As you exhale, let it all out. You see your chest lower, and what's happening is your diaphragm is going to relax, and a different pair of muscles is going to pull your lungs back in. And this is a fabulous video that's going to show you those muscles in action. So what do you need to know? The human respiratory system consists of airways through which gases move to and from paired lungs. Your discussion board asks you guys to describe the movement of air in the body, and that's because I expect you to know that on your exam. In addition to its function in gas exchange, the human respiratory system has roles in speech, temperature regulation, and the sense of smell. So let's talk about how you breathe. A respiratory cycle is one breath in, or inhalation, and one breath out, or exhalation. Changes in volume of lungs and thoracic cavity during a respiratory cycle alter pressure gradients between the air inside and outside the respiratory tract. So when you breathe in, you're increasing the air pressure inside your lungs, and as you exhale, you're decreasing that air pressure. So respiratory cycle is one inhalation and one exhalation. Inhalation is always active, driven by muscle contractions. So like I said, during inhalation, so if we all breathe in, your diaphragm is going to contract and move down, and that's going to allow for the muscles to contract and lift your rib cage upward and outward. That's why when you breathe in, you see your chest rise. And then as you exhale, the diaphragm and those muscles return to a resting position, and your rib cage moves down, and your lungs recoil passively, or basically they contract. What's interesting is your book goes into the Heimlich maneuver, but it's actually a really helpful thing to know, so I go over it as well. The Heimlich maneuver is used to rescue a person who's choking on something lodged in their trachea. Remember, your trachea is literally the tube right beside, right before you get to your bronchiole. So it's after your epiglottis. So that means that food has made it past your epiglottis and is now lodged right above your lungs where air cannot get in. So what the rescuer does is they're going to press forcefully on a person's abdomen and force air out of the lungs to dislodge the object. If you've ever seen Mrs. Doubtfire, there's a great scene on that. And on the next slide, there is a really awesome video that teaches you how to do the Heimlich on all sorts of different people. Pregnant women, infants, heavier set people, and then just your regular old Joes. So the Heimlich maneuver. First, you need to determine if the person's actually choking. If you don't know the universal sign for choking, I highly recommend you look it up. It's literally putting your hands up against your throat. Then you're going to stand behind the person and place one fist below his or her rib cage, just above the belly button with your thumb facing inward. You're going to cover your fist with the other hand and thrust inward and upward, and repeat until the object is expelled. Watch the YouTube video. I didn't know how to do Heimlich maneuver on infants or pregnant women, and that's actually something really good to know. And also, you never know, maybe I'll see you on the 10 o'clock news and you'll have saved someone's life at a restaurant. So how is your breathing controlled? Well, neurons in the medulla oblongata, remember that part of the brain, because I can ask you that on your exam, of the brainstem acts basically as your pacemaker for inhalation. So your medulla oblongata is basically what is going to control when you inhale and exhale. Nerves are going to deliver signals calling for contraction of the diaphragm and intercostal muscles, and you inhale. And between signals, the muscles will relax and exhale. So breathing patterns can also be altered voluntarily. If you guys do any yoga or any type of self-care that involves breathing exercises, you know that you can control your breathing. And my athletes in this course know that as well. So please know that the part of the brain that controls your breathing is the medulla oblongata. Also, breathing patterns change with activity level. If you're a runner like myself, or if you do a lot of exercising, you will notice that as you exert yourself more, the harder you're going to breathe. What happens is when you're doing any types of activities like running, playing basketball, or football, that activity is going to increase your CO2 production because remember, it's oxygen plus glucose that's going to lead to CO2 and waste and water. So as your activity increases, your body's going to be using up more of that glucose or sugar, which is going to increase your CO2 production. When you increase your CO2 production in your body, it's going to increase the acid levels in your blood. And what you have is you actually have chemoreceptors in your heart. And if they detect acidity in your blood, they're going to tell the brain, hey brain, tell that medulla oblongata that we need more oxygen. And so what happens is an increase in CO2 in your blood is going to lead to you needing to breathe harder to get rid of that CO2 in your body and bring in more oxygen to your muscles. So key concepts: inhalation is always an active process. It occurs when a part of the brain stem signals muscles to contract and increase the size of the thoracic cavity. And exhalation is usually passive. Muscles relax, the chest and the lungs shrink, and air flows out of lungs. So let's talk about exactly how this gas exchange occurs. So gases diffuse between air and fluid at the alveoli. So please know the alveoli, those little berry-shaped things at the very end of your bronchioles, are where gas exchange occurs. Oxygen is going to diffuse from the alveoli into a capillary at the lung's respiratory membrane. So literally across your lungs, you're going to have the exchange of oxygen into a red blood cell, and that red blood cell is also going to be exchanging CO2 back into the lungs. Remember, diffusion occurs from a high concentration to a low concentration. So if you breathe into your lungs and there's a high concentration of oxygen, it's going to diffuse into a red blood cell that doesn't have a lot of oxygen. And that CO2, which is high in the red blood cell, is going to diffuse out into the lungs where there isn't much CO2. Oxygen and carbon dioxide diffuse passively across the respiratory membrane, which is your lungs, and the net direction of movement of these gases depends upon the concentration gradients of each gas across the membrane. So remember, gases are going to exchange from a high concentration to a low concentration. So when you breathe in, you have a high concentration of oxygen in your lungs, which is going to fuse into your red blood cells. And your red blood cells are going to be full of CO2, which are going to fuse into your lungs, which don't have a lot of CO2 or carbon dioxide. So oxygen follows this partial pressure gradient across the respiratory membrane, into the plasma membrane, and finally into the red blood cells. Basically, what I'm telling you is oxygen is going to flow from the lungs into the red blood cells, and the red blood cells are then going to have carbon dioxide released and flow back into the lungs. Hemoglobin contains something called heme groups, and they're the ones that are going to release oxygen in places where there is low oxygen levels. So for example, in your muscles and tissues that need oxygen, what's going to happen is the red blood cells are going to release that oxygen into those tissues and pick up the CO2. CO2 also follows this diffusion. So CO2 is going to leave those tissues and go to the red blood cells, which have a lower concentration. And when those red blood cells get to the lungs, what's going to happen is they're going to release that CO2 into the lungs where there is a low concentration of CO2. This is a fantastic video I highly recommend you guys watch that shows the gas exchange and transport across the body. And it basically sums up what I just said, but in much simpler terms. So CO2 is carbon dioxide, or two oxygens. Carbon monoxide is just CO. And carbon monoxide is extremely important to understand, particularly during hurricane season when we use generators. Carbon monoxide is a colorless, odorless gas. And what happens is it's super dangerous to humans because it can bind to hemoglobin more tightly than than oxygen. And so what happens is if you breathe in carbon monoxide, it's going to bind to the hemoglobin in your red blood cells, and then your red blood cells cannot pick up oxygen anymore. So when carbon monoxide builds up in air, it blocks the oxygen binding sites on the hemoglobin, preventing oxygen transport and causing carbon monoxide poisoning. And the symptoms include nausea, headache, confusion, dizziness, and weakness. And carbon monoxide is commonly released from gas burning vehicles, but also from generators. And I highly recommend that you watch this YouTube video because it talks more about how carbon monoxide works and the warning signs of it so that you can be careful and ensure that you don't get any carbon monoxide poisoning. If you've ever been to Colorado or gone hiking before, oxygen in air is going to decrease with altitude. So if you ever go to some place like Denver, Colorado, you might be kind of hard for you to catch your breath for a couple of days. And that's because people from low altitude like us are literally need to acclimate to the high altitude through altered breathing patterns and increased red blood cell production and other changes. That's why athletes and Olympians will train in Denver or in high altitudes, because then when they actually participate in sports or run their races in lower altitudes, they have more red blood cells, and they can perform better. So how does height affect us? Literally, the higher you go, the less oxygen there is in the air. And so you need to alter your breathing pattern and drink lots of water to keep your lungs nice and moist. And usually what happens is people will adapt by increasing their red blood cell count in their bodies as well. So what should you know? Oxygen moves from air in the lungs into pulmonary capillaries where it binds with hemoglobin. Hemoglobin will release oxygen to your active tissues, and carbon dioxide will then go into those red blood cells. At the lungs, carbon dioxide will then be exhaled. I wanted to go over a little bit of respiratory diseases and disorders just because we hear commonly about them on the news, and I think it's important for you guys to know. So, interrupted breathing, infectious organisms, and chronic inflammation can impair your respiratory function. And as I hope you all realize, your respiratory system is incredibly important for you to stay alive. Interrupted breathing disorders include things like apnea and sudden infant death syndrome. Respiratory diseases include tuberculosis, pneumonia, bronchitis, and emphysema. And smoking causes or worsens many respiratory problems. That includes e-cigarettes. So the first one is sleep apnea. Sleep apnea is literally you stop breathing spontaneously through your sleep. So you'll stop breathing and then start again. This usually occurs in people who have like really bad snoring. So they'll snore and then all of a sudden they'll stop. And then they'll like gasp for air and start up again. And people who have sleep apnea usually need to sleep with some sort of breathing device to ensure that they're sleeping. The other one is sudden infant death syndrome, or SIDS. This occurs when an infant doesn't awaken from an episode of apnea. So literally the infant just stops breathing in the middle of the night. Infants are more at risk if their mother smoked or was exposed to smoke during pregnancy. Infants are also at risk if you use bumpers in the cribs or if the child rolls over into a blanket where it's difficult for them to roll back out. Tuberculosis and pneumonia. Tuberculosis, what's really interesting is about 1 in 3 people is infected with the bacteria that causes tuberculosis and they have no symptoms. An active case of tuberculosis can be fatal, but antibiotics can cure most cases of tuberculosis. For anyone who's going to be working with children, it's almost guaranteed that you're going to have a TB test. And that's to ensure that you are not carrying tuberculosis and could give it to a child. Pneumonia is a very general term for lung inflammation and can be caused by a bacteria, a virus, or a fungi. And what happens in pneumonia is fluid will build up in the lungs. So if a doctor suspects that you have pneumonia, what they do is they'll do a chest x-ray. And if they see any clouding in the lungs, that's usually fluid buildup. And it's really hard for you to breathe if you have fluid in your lungs. Other types of ailments include bronchitis and asthma. Bronchitis is an inflammation of your bronchi. So remember we learned about the bronchi. Those are the tubes that go out to your alveoli. So if they get inflamed or bacteria colonize inside of it, that's going to block your airways. And then asthma is an inhaled allergen or irritant, triggers inflammation and constriction of the airways. So literally people feel like a fish out of water. They just cannot breathe. An emphysema is tissue destroying bacterial enzymes will literally digest the alveolar wall of your lungs. So remember, your alveoli is where gas exchange occurs. So if you have emphysema and the tissues of your alveoli are getting destroyed, it's going to be a lot harder for you to get the oxygen you breathe in into your bloodstream and the CO2 in your blood out of your bloodstream. So key concepts: interrupted breathing, such as apnea, infectious diseases, such as tuberculosis, and inflammatory conditions, such as asthma and bronchitis, can interfere with normal respiratory functions. These are your key terms. And then these are your student learning objectives. I highly recommend that you use your student learning objectives as a study guide to study for your exam. Thanks.